Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about settler colonialism and the worker strike. This will probably be the last video that I end up doing in this series, and I've had a really good time talking about a lot of the stuff in this series because I think that it's been really good to be able to have conversations about the various ways that different systems of violence are kind of like interacting with the question of worker strike and how the history of kind of like colonial dispossession and genocide relate to the question of how the worker strike is able to be oriented and created. And in this last section of videos, we've definitely been able to get into something that I haven't been able to do with all the series, which is just talking about what I think are some of the kinds of really like nuanced ways that settler colonialism can be read as a criticism against critical affirmatives, and the way that it kind of like sets up interesting questions for how you should be answering critical affirmatives. In the last video, I think we did a little bit kind of just covering what we were thinking about in terms of like the kind of like central thesis debate and what your priority should be when you're trying to read this against critical teams. And in this video, I definitely want to continue that into a conversation that we're having here about how you should kind of be resolving questions like the link debate, the permutation debate, impact comparison, alternative debating. It's definitely important if these two videos are the last time you're kind of, or the first time that you're kind of hearing me talking about settler colonialism and the worker strike, for you to go back and look at some of the other stuff that I've kind of done in this series, whether it even only be like the introduction to the settler colonialism and the worker strike, which I think are all really good places to start kind of like what I think is the foundational conversation that led us to this point, and kind of like made this set of videos kind of last so long. And so hopefully getting the context for all that can help you understand where we are here and where we're kind of concluding. So the first thing I think is really important when we're kind of on this section of the debate, which is like, what do you think about like how we should be using the link arguments in these cases and creating diverse link arguments against various teams? I think that there are a lot of things to be said about like how you can make this work. I think that a lot of it kind of comes from a lot of the stuff that we talked about in the previous video about the various ways that the thesis kind of portion of the debate creates the basis for how you're able to diversify a lot of your link arguments, and why having like really like detailed link arguments tend to do a lot in order to feed your kind of like alternative in various ways. I think that if you're able to like win arguments both on the place of like how you're able to disidentify with the affirmative at the level of its kind of like historical theorizing for like how violence operates in the way it appears and its relationship to what that looks like in terms of our material practices that we take up in the face of that, then you have two vectors to really work off of in terms of like how you're able to kind of refuse the way in which they're kind of like proposing various types of practices that pursue or engage in forms of like genocide and colonial erasure that you're kind of like already spotting a lot of these arguments from above. I think that beyond that, a lot of the things that I would push teams to do, kind of like what I've said in other places when talking about settler colonialism, is to definitely use skills that require you to kind of like diversify your impact scenarios in relationship to your link arguments in order to give you like a larger breadth of things to kind of like weigh offensively against the affirmative with these link arguments. I think that the more examples you can kind of pull that kind of like feed into why the particular framing of history in relationship to how we should be theorizing the state vacuously, or the relationship to the workers that we should have to the worker strike, whether that be doing the worker strike or something other, why those kind of like historical stances without a proper recognition of the ways in which they could be participating or in relationship to genocidal structures really allows you a lot of stuff to make kind of arguments over like the untextured detailed that comes from the affirmative team, that I think allows you to also win why there is kind of like a change of like how these methods would go down or what they would look like in the context of just how they would look, considering like settler colonial violence as something that like changes how we're thinking about like what epistemology is, what our relationship to the human is, and like what it really means to do forms of subject formation, and how to kind of like separate that from very colonial interpretations of just like what Western modernity looks like, etc. I then think that when you're kind of like moving into places like the permutation, it's really important for you to be able to like be able to refuse a lot of the offense that teams are going to be bringing in order to create and push down link turns as net benefits to things like the permutations that they want to read. I feel like when you're trying to be back against a permutation, it's really important to have a good way of explaining your alternative, even if it's just refusal, that really gives you unique benefit and net benefits to like doing something apart from doing the affirmative, and how the affirmative doesn't make sense in the world of the alternatives world. Obviously, this is something that you want to do with all permutations, but I think particularly in the context of settler colonialism, there's so many arguments to be made about like why the refusal of the kind of time of the nature of demands that are kind of made for like a kind of like end all be all strategy or a solution to violence like proposed by those that are kind of like impacted by settler colonialism only like basically recreate the kind of like unfair burdens that are created under colonial erasure, and ultimately destroy ways of making like settlers and making those that kind of participate in genocide accountable for violence that they participate in. And so I feel like there are a lot of ways in which you can kind of then create new link arguments about the ways in which affirmatives kind of create this kind of view to innocence and pivot themselves in order to recognize those histories of violence once the negative is kind of already entered into the debate, and why that kind of like necessitates a particular refusal of the types of practices that these affirmatives really want to be engaging in. I then think that when you're trying to move to the impact comparison portion of the debate, this is where things are not really a question of whether or not you can like win that one type of like violence outweighs another particularly, but rather that there's a historical way in which violence exists and that it doesn't come out of nowhere, that there are historical kind of relationships that constitute why certain dynamics exist and why those dynamics are kind of like used in order to create various like scenes of violence and how that violence is able to be distributed onto various populations. And so there has to be a textual analysis of the ways in which that violence erupts and the way in which it contributes to various forms of like structural kind of like framings for how the world works, and why then there needs to be a differential understanding of like how we should think about violence in relationship to accumulation in the past and not just how we count bodies as we move to the future. I feel like being able to situate arguments in that way can really allow you to win. Why, if you're winning some of these thesis level concerns and the risk of the link arguments, that it makes a lot more sense to refer your kind of historical understanding of the way violence erupts and the possible solutions that can come from that analytic, which a lot of their arguments may not tap into as much. This means that when you get to the alternative portion of the debate, a lot of the stuff that you really want to be doing is just developing why the kind of conditions that are created in a world where you're able to refuse the terms in which these kind of responsibilities are created in order to like push like particular communities and being like inversely responsible for the creation of like various forms and seeds of colonial violence. I think you have a lot of arguments to make about like what this does to make a different type of answer to questions that like may not be ones that are like slated by the resolution itself, but are necessary to be able to interrogate the various ways that settler colonialism kind of like conditions the status quo to operate in a particular way. This means things like various arguments about refusal and various arguments about indeterminacy become good ways for you to actually spot various historical examples of how the kind of like refusal to be able to bend to like the demands of like various types of sovereign capacities or like various types of institutions has created various forms of scenes of alternative resistance that are like creative and beautiful in the way in which they undo the various sources of violence that genocide continues to like pursue. And I think that being able to situate your alternative in a way that does that align with like a lot of the other concerns above makes it a lot harder for teams to be able to pivot into permutations that make your alternative work against you. Hopefully this video will be helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into more videos I'll be doing in the future. And yeah, thanks as always.